Good evening, team. This is video number 2 for week 5 of PMP 472 Applied Project Management. Okay, team, this is going to be a little challenging chapter. This chapter, we're going to review progress and performance measurements. So, in the previous sections, we've defined our project, we built out our WPS, we built a network, we built a Gantt chart, we've compressed it, we did estimations. Now we're going to look at tools, metrics to be able to measure the performance of your project throughout the life of the project. Now, this will be a little more uh, formula intense. There's going to be several different formulas and calculations associated with this week. Um, don't worry about it. If you have questions, call, text, email me. I'm happy to further explain, but we will be walking through several formulas in tonight's lecture. So, the overall objective is we're going to take a look at the 4 steps for controlling a project. We're going to leverage the Gantt chart as a tool to monitor time performance or to monitor the scheduling and cost performance. We're going to have a whole section on earned value management, and we'll talk more about this. We'll talk about and how to interpret cost, schedule, variance, as well as schedule performance indexes, SPIs, and CPIs, cost performance indexes. We'll talk about calculating the final cost of the project, the planned estimate at complete, the actual estimate at complete, and then we'll talk a lot about scope creep and how that can impact an overall schedule from a project from a scheduling perspective as well as from a cost perspective. So we're going to cover a lot of different areas on tonight's video. Okay, so let's talk about, you know, the 4 different aspects of monitoring a project. So when we monitor a project, these are the 4 things we have to consider. Number 1, what data do we want to collect in order to gauge how our project is performing? We need to determine the how, the when, and the who of collecting the data. Now, how are we going to collect it? How often are we going to collect it? Monthly, biweekly, weekly, and then who on the project team is going to collect it? We're going to talk about how do you analyze the data, and are we tracking to schedule, behind schedule, to costs, under costs, over costs, and how to do the analysis. And then we're going to talk a lot about the reporting. How do you keep your project sponsor, your stakeholders, and your team informed of how we are progressing on the project? So we're going to cover a lot of different areas. So let's talk about what data we're going to connect or collect. So when you take a look at the overall project, let's say you're building a project that's going to last 12 months. You're building a new website or you're building a new building on a piece of property. Throughout the overall project, you're going to have to be able to report the status. How are we doing against the plan or baseline schedule? How are we doing toward the planned or the baseline cost? Um, how much will it cost to complete? So if we are 6 months into the 12-month project, how much more do we have to invest to continue and complete the project or estimate to complete? Um, you will always have questions around what will be the project cost when it's completed and when it will be completed the project schedule. Um, with any status, you have to address risk, issues, concerns, and blockers. So those are always part of a project status. Now, when we take a look at if a project is running behind schedule or running over cost, you'll want to include the what, the who, and the where, the causes behind those overruns. So that will be part of an overall status. And then, if a project has cost overruns in the middle of the schedule or schedule delays, um, how can we adjust and what are the mitigation strategies to bring it back in line to the cost? Or how do we accelerate to come back in to the timeline or the targeted date? So these are some of the questions you must ask yourself as you're starting a project so you can plan on how you're going to communicate this and the status throughout the life of the project. Okay. So, who's going to collect all this data? You need to, within the team, and as part of your roles and responsibilities, or your RACI, which we talked about, I believe, in chapter in week 3, um, who's going to collect all this information? Is the project team? Do you have contractors? Do you have cost engineers? Are you, as a project manager, going to collect the information? How are you going to collect it? Is it going to be electronic? Are you going to be able to aggregate and collect the data? What is the frequency? Do you need to monitor the costs and schedule hourly, daily, weekly, biweekly, monthly? So these are all the things that you need to establish at the very beginning of the project with your sponsor. How are you going to report the progress and the status of a project throughout its life cycle? And then, a lot of companies, and we'll talk a little bit more about um, project maturity of a company. A lot of companies have central repositories where all of this metric are located for ongoing reviews. So often when you start a new project, you can go to the central repository, look at similar types of projects and see what metrics were captured, how the team performed, what kind of risks, and be able to leverage those lessons learned for your project. And that is a critical part of maturing a company over time. How do you get better with doing your projects? Okay, when you're looking at status reporting, all the controls, all the metrics, you need to decide who gets the progress reports. Is it only the sponsors? Is it stakeholders? It's the team members? Is it the client, the customer? You need to talk about how are you going to transmit it? Are those going to be within a status meeting? Are they biweekly reports? Are you going to distribute them? But when you take a look at most projects, the three critical areas you need to look at always revolve around, schedule, cost, and scope. That's what most, stakeholders are really looking at. Are you on track? Are you ahead of schedule or behind schedule? Are you under cost? Are you over cost? And are all the features I'm looking for going to be delivered, or are we going to miss some of the deliverables? So when you're looking at the reports, those are the three key metrics you always want to be able to communicate with your project. Now, other things you need to communicate are your risk, your problems, your issues, and your blockers. What new issues have occurred? Are there any changes? Are there any risk or issues or problems you need to communicate to the stakeholders. And with any of those issues, you really need to ensure you have a corrective action plan to address. Now, a corrective action plan is same thing as like a risk mitigation. So you need to make sure if something has occurred, how are you going to adjust and get the project back on schedule? So if you say you have a 12-month project that's going to cost $1 million to complete, you're in month six and you've already spent $700,000, you're running over budget. What are you doing to be able to complete within budget? What actions are you going to take to be able to help readjust your project back to the baseline schedule? So these are things you would need to make sure you include in any status or progress report on any of your initiatives. Now, if you look at everything we've talked about, it's really talking about control. You've identified a project, you've identified all the deliverables, you've mapped everything out in your project network. You've determined the dependencies and the predecessors. You've estimated costs. You build it into a Gantt chart, and now you first thing you do is you create your baseline. And at the very beginning of a project, this is exactly what you planned. This project will take 12 months. It requires these people with these skills. You're going to deliver these capabilities at various times throughout the 12 months. And here's how you're progressing. That is your baseline. So throughout the project, you're going to be measuring that performance, your progress. How is your actual compared to your plan? And then how are you taking action if the two differ? So that is what we talk about a project control or a project control process. Okay. So a lot of times way or the tool you use to be able to monitor a project and the costs, the schedule is really the Gantt chart. So the Gantt chart you guys built out in week 4, that is typically the base tool you use to see how you are progressing within a project. Now, we did it in Excel, but many companies have project management software tools that you put all of your activities in, what resources you need, when they start, when they finish, and then you update their progress each day or week or biweekly. And the software will tell you how you're progressing. Are you over budget? Are you under budget? Are you on schedule? You're not on schedule. So a lot of the software will do that for you now. It's a little more challenging when you're doing it in Excel, but I think you'll get the main concept and ideas. So if we take a look at our Gantt charts, that's specifically what they're designed to do, to give you a nice visual of how and what you're delivering, the dependencies, and how you're progressing. So, for example, last week, I think it was your Nightingale project, you had a series of activities. They lasted a certain amount of time. Let's just call these months. Activity A takes 2 months, then you can do B and C at the same time in parallel, and you're mapping these out. This is considered to be your baseline, Gantt chart. So as you start working your project, you're starting to record your actuals. So, I mean, if you look at the second chart, this is 6 months into a 12-month project. And so that's where you are 6 months. So if you look at 6 months in your baseline, well, you should have activity A done. You should have activity B done, C done. You should be in the middle of activity D, and you should be starting activity E. So at 6 months, that's where you estimated you would be. So if you take a look at this, this shows you, well, gee, activity A, you thought it was 2 months, you finished in 2 months. You're doing great. You thought B was going to be 3 months, and you got it in 3 months. Activity C, you thought it was going to be 4 months, but you actually finished in 3 months. So you're ahead of schedule for C. And then you're 1 month into activity D, which is exactly where you thought. And guess what? You were able to accelerate start activity E even earlier. So this tells you a nice graphic of where you are within a project and are you completing the task you thought you were going to complete on time. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, text me, email me, ask questions. I'll respond back. Just let me know what areas you're having a challenge with. So throughout this project, what you're doing is every week or 2 weeks, you're meeting with the team, you're finding out how they're progressing with their work, and you're tracking it. And what you do is you create a control chart. So this says at 1 month, you should have X completed based upon your Gantt chart. So you're tracking, well, we're a little behind schedule in week 1. Well, we started to catch up a little bit, but we're still behind schedule in week 2. Then we fell way behind schedule in week 3. By week 4, we were back to what our plan was. Week 5 and 6, we're ahead of schedule. So if you look at this, this kind of graphically shows you how your team is progressing through the months completing the project. So if you saw a chart like this and you saw this line continually going down and you're continually behind schedule, those are some red flags and indicators that, well, it looks like you're not going to be able to complete your goal and your task that better be communicated to the sponsors, the executives, to see how you're going to improve your project. If this continues up and you're ahead of schedule, then you may be able to finish the project earlier, maybe even ahead of schedule, or complete it uh, under cost. So this is just a way of monitoring how you're doing from a scheduling perspective. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about earned value. Now, as you saw in the video, earned value has been around for a long time, 60 years. So about 60 years ago, the Department of Defense was running hundreds of different projects, different programs, and they had a really hard time trying to see what was ahead of schedule, what was behind, what was running over cost, what was running under cost. So they started putting together equations and a way of tracking project uh, to their schedule. So they have a series of formulas. And team, I apologize. This is where we go into a lot of formulas and a lot of equations that are used to track a schedule. I'll provide you a couple cheat sheets on how to be able to calculate these, but just be aware most project management software packages crack these formulas for you if you have all the information into the project. So become familiar with them. If you're going to take the CAPM, the Certified Associate Project Manager, or the PMP, you will need to know the equations, how to calculate them. You will be tested on these. If you're not, it's good to be aware of some of these values. And some of these values, like actual cost. So, what is the actual cost? So, that's this line right here, the actual cost. What is the actual cost of the work you've already done on the project? So, if this is a 12-month project and you're 6 months into it, how much have you actually spent? Labor, direct, indirect, etc. Then, you have, your plan value. We have a few around estimate cost at completion. So let's say you're 6 months into a project. The EAC or estimate completion is how much have you already spent for the first 6 months, plus what do you calculate to be the next 6 months of spend? So how much will it cost to get to the end of the project? Now, ETC, estimate to complete. So let's say you have $1 million project that's going to last 12 months, you're 6 months into it, and you've already spent 700,000. So your actual cost is 700,000. You have 6 more months to go. Based upon what you still have to deliver, you think it's going to cost another 500,000. So you've already spent 700. You think it's going to be 500,000 more. So your estimate at completion would be 1.2 million. You still have 500,000 remaining of work and you've already spent 700,000. So that gives you some good dollar metrics to show how you're progressing. So if we look at this, let's just use the same example. You're 6 months in, you've already spent 700,000. But let's say you look at your Gantt chart, your cost of what you plan on delivering at 6 months in. Let's say you thought it was only going to be 500,000. So if you look at your cost variance, you spent 700,000, you thought you were going to spend only 500,000, you're 200,000 over budget. So, gee, your 200,000 is your cost variance. Um, and then you get same kind of things with your schedule variance. If you thought you would complete X number of deliverables and you're ahead or behind, that defines your schedule variance. So we'll walk more through these equations, but you know, good thing to get a good general understanding of how they work, how they operate, because that's going to tell you are you over or under budget? Are you ahead or behind of schedule? And if you're ahead or behind, what do you think the end price will be? Are you going to be above schedule or below budget on your end project? So we'll overview these a lot more, but these are going to be critical equations to understand. Okay, so when we talk about developing a integrated cost schedule system, all that means is you've defined your work breakdown structure, you know what the scope is, you know what the deliverables are, you know what your resources are, you know the cost for each of those activities. You've built it into a project network. You built it into a Gantt chart. You're going to monitor that weekly or biweekly or monthly. How are you progressing to your schedule? And that is going to roll up to your status reporting. That's all we're looking at doing here. Okay. So the whole thing starts with your project baseline. So, if you take a look at the different phases of a project, you initiate a project, you plan a project, you develop or execute a project, you test, you close. Each of those stages within the project management lifecycle, as you're initiating, you're defining what you're doing, as you know. When you're planning out what you're delivering, who do you need to uses resources. You understand how long each task is going to take. You know the cost of each task, either labor cost or material cost, and you build that into your project plan, your Gantt chart. That is your baseline. That's all it is. So it just includes all of the different areas that you've calculated out in the past. So throughout the project, all you're doing is comparing your plan with the reality. We're 1 month in. I expected to complete this item and this item. I expected it to cost this much money. How much did it actually cost? That's all you're doing throughout the project. So if you were developing a cybersecurity training over 6 months, and by month 3, you had already expected to have all of the training material defined. You expect to already have onboarded your trainers. You've already scheduled your training classes. You've already done your security analysis. Well, by 3 months in, have you actually done that? So it's just a way of tracking what you plan versus what you're actually delivering. Hopefully that makes sense. So throughout the project, really what you're looking for is cost variance. Now, the work I've already completed, is it more or less than I have planned to complete by that time? All the work I had planned on completing, is it done by the time I had planned? That's all you're doing, is monitoring that status throughout the project. Then you can cycle that into nice, pretty graphs. And this is kind of an eye chart, so I'll see if I can explain it to you. So your planned value baseline, your PV baseline, at the beginning of the project, this is the value of the items that you thought you were going to be delivering throughout the project. So if we look at this, let's call these days. You had planned on completing the project by 45 days, and you thought the project was only going to cost $400 to complete in the 45 days. So in your plan, this is how much you thought you were going to be spending throughout the project to complete all of your deliverables. So now you're halfway into the project. You're 25 days into what you thought was a 45-day project. Your actual earned value, so this is what you thought you were going to complete. How much did you actually complete? So if I look at this chart, this tells me, well, after 25 days, I've only delivered $200 worth of my deliverables, and I really thought I was going to be delivering $300 worth of my deliverables. So just by looking at this, I'm not delivering what I thought I would at this time. So I'm, from a schedule perspective, behind schedule. When I take a look at my actual cost, our cost, right, $340. So I'm spending $40 more than I thought I would. So if you look at this, right as of today, by today, we are over cost and we have not delivered as much as we thought we would. So we're overspending and we're behind schedule. This is not a good situation to be in. Now, at this point, I then calculate, well, I've already spent $340. It's going to cost me probably $475 to finish. So I think it's going to cost me more and it's not going to be completed until 50 days. So when I look at this project, it immediately tells me, well, I'm going to spend about $75 more money, and it's going to take 5 days longer than I thought. Now, for a $500 project, it may not be a big deal. For a $500,000 project or a $500 million project, that's some prig variance. So this is again just a way of taking a look. How am I running against my um, cost and my schedule? Am I above or below? Am I ahead of schedule or am I behind schedule? Now, the book gives you a couple of different examples of this. So you can look at each of these charts and try to determine above or behind. So when you take a look at this, you can take a look just by the graphs. Am I ahead of schedule or behind schedule? Am I overspending or am I underspending? So get to understand actual cost, land value, and earned value. This will really help you determine how are you progressing on a project. And if I look at this, there is various different formulas to be able to show you, and I'll walk you through just a couple. So let's say you're building a camera, and there's like 6 slides on this. So I'm gonna do a high level on this just so you get an idea. So your project is to build a digital camera. You have 6 different tasks. You got to design it, you got to build a shell, memory, zoom system, assembly, and testing. This is what your baseline is. So you thought it was going to take 11 months to complete everything. Now, if you look at each activity, activity A, you know, it's going to be 20% of the budget or 20% of the cost. So let me jump back up to here for a second. Might be a little bit easier. So if you look at this is the work breakdown structure associated with that. So the total cost is $320. The design's going to cost $20, the shell 15, storage 100, zoom 35, and assembly 150. So this is the value of each of those components. So if you look at, the design was $20. It was going to take 2 weeks to do the design. So $10 and $10. Your B, which is the shell, $15. The memory, $100. So $100 is going to take 4 months to be able to deliver. So you plan it out, over each month. So this kind of shows how much money you were planning on spending and delivering month over month for your project. So as you monitor the progress, if you are complete with A, then you've earned $20. If you're complete with B, 15. If you're 50% complete with C, then you've earned 50% of the value, or $50. So you can use this to see how much value you've earned over the length of the project. So from that, you can calculate, am I under budget? Am I over budget? Am I ahead of schedule or am I behind schedule? And that's the real goal of this. So, when I take a look at, an example, so this is your digital camera and you thought it was going to take 11 months at the beginning. You're looking at it, you're now 7 months into it. Design. You knew it was going to take 2 months and cost $20. You've completed it and you completed it in 2 months. That's great. Your shell, you thought it was only going to take 2 months. It actually took 3 months. So you're a little behind on schedule. Your memory, you thought it was going to take 4 months. It's taking you 5 months so far, and you still have a month of work remaining. So this will help you gauge a project all the way throughout. So looking at this project, I can see that I won't be done until month 13, not 11 like I anticipated. Many of the projects are running longer and at higher budget, and I'm behind. So that's the whole purpose of tracking a schedule, is to be able to very early on being able to communicate to your stakeholders, your sponsor, your leadership team, how you are progressing on your project. Are you under, over budget? Are you ahead or behind on schedule? So a lot of these, they use what's called performance indicators. Um, CPI is a cost performance indicator. SPI is the schedule performance indicator. And these are very simple calculations. And again, the software tools can calculate this for you automatically, but it's good to understand the equations and how to use it in case you're tested on it or you go through certification. So cost, well, very simply is how much value have I earned? What have I completed divided by the actual cost? Scheduling, how much have I completed versus what I plan to complete. So these will give you some good indicators on how you're progressing. So when you look at it, your CPI and SPIs, if you are running a one, what you expected it to cost and what it actually costs, what you actually delivered versus what you plan to deliver are the same. That's a one. No, no, a number divided by the same number is one. So that means you're on cost and you're on schedule. If it's greater, then you're under cost and ahead of schedule. If you are under one, you're over cost and behind schedule. So CPI and SPIs are often included in those project status reports so that individuals can quickly look at these two numbers and tell them, if I'm running, to give you an example, a SPI of zero point 0.8 and a CPI of zero point 0.7, I automatically know, gee, my project's over cost and behind schedule. So, as an executive, I would say, well, you're running a zero point 0.8 and a zero point 0.7. What are you doing to keep your project on schedule and on cost? What are your mitigation plans? What do you plan on doing? Um, is the project going to cost more than expected? Do we need to rebaseline? Do we need to evaluate if the project's worth investing additional money into? If it's behind schedule, what are we doing to compress it? If we try to compress it, is there additional cost? So these are the questions you're asked to be able to ensure you're monitoring and managing a project correctly. Hopefully that makes sense. Um, Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on these. This is really around, let's use that camera example in the memory. If you know the memory is going to take 4 months to develop, do you count any value if it's partially done? Some companies will give value or credit if something is partially done. So if my memory is 50% done, then I'm going to get 50% of the value. Sometimes companies want just the percentage. If I'm 25%, I get 25% of the value. So it's really up to a company. Some companies will do a 50-50. So you will get no credit for something being completed until it's at least 50% done. Some companies use a rule of 0-100, which means you get no credit unless something is actually completed. And it's really based upon the company. So, for example, like manufacturing or construction, you know, if I'm building a new office building and my foundation is only half done, well, the footers are in, the concrete is going to be scheduled next week, but it's going to take 3 months for it or 2 months for it to harden and cure. Do I get credit for being half done? Or do I get no credit until it's completely 100% done? So this is really up to how the company likes to monitor progress. I've seen it done in many different ways. The standard is really percent. If I'm 10% done, I get 10% of the credit. If I'm 100% done, I get 100%. So they usually do percentage, but we want to show you there are other ways companies can do it. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about final cost. Again, let's say you're 6 months into a project, you've already spent 500,000. What is the remaining cost to complete? So you'll get into a lot of those estimations because if you're ahead of schedule, the sponsors typically like to know, are you going to be under budget? Can I move money to other areas? If you're going to be over budget, am I going to have to find additional money to fund your project? So final cost estimation becomes very, very critical as you look at an overarching schedule. Now, scope creep. This happens all the time. And whenever you're working a project, um, there's a difference between change request, which is the sponsor or the company decides to add more features, more capabilities, or even sometimes they take away features or capabilities, and then you have to re-baseline. Scope can be minor changes that the team takes on. Now, these minor changes, may seem like it's really nothing. Well, it takes an extra day and it makes Bob happy. But you have to really watch out for these because it can be a death by a million cuts. If you do one minor change and another minor change, those eventually add up. And then all of a sudden, your project is behind schedule. It's going to take longer. It's going to run over costs. So these things you have to really be very careful about accepting and controlling in your project. Now, does that mean things are not going to change? Oh, absolutely. In a project over 6 months or a year, you might be 3 or 4 months into it and something changes. A new competitor, you have to accelerate a project. There are new features you need to add. Typically, when you have those major changes in the project and you've already you've already built your project plan, your Gantt chart, your estimations, you do something called a rebaselining. And those are when you go back in and say, if I need to add this to a project or I need to compress a project, what will it cost? And you go back in and you have to recalculate your entire plan to be able to get approval, funding, etc., to increase a budget so you can accomplish it, or if things are being removed, what is the saving? So part of a project manager and a leader's role is to maintain how the project's progressing, but to address changes and rebaselining. So hopefully you can start thinking about, oh my gosh, what if I get a lot of changes throughout a project? I'm constantly getting changes to my project. That can become an absolute nightmare because you're constantly updating and reforecasting and recalculating how much it's going to cost and how long your schedule is going to take. When we get to the next section about agile programming, that addresses some of those rapid changes and how it makes project management a lot easier using agile when you change things often. Okay, so we've hit on a lot of equations, a lot of key terms. Um, Review over them. Critical ones, your CPI, your SPI. Those are your schedule and your costs. Your cost variance and your schedule variance. Am I ahead or behind schedule, over or under cost? Your earned value, critical ones. Your, I'm looking for it here, actual cost. I don't see it on here, but that's a critical one, your actual cost. And then again, you're leveraging the Gantt chart to be able to calculate out a lot of this information. And again, in most companies, 99.9%, you have software that will calculate all these formulas out for you, but it's good to know the formulas and what they actually mean. So that was earned value and everything associated with earned value. So one of the class discussions, or not class discussions, but one of the class in-class initiatives or projects for this week was around earned value management. Now, obviously, since we're going to be uh, videos and not actually in the class this week, um, take the time to go and start drafting out earned value and address some of the questions around earned value, the data sources, and whether or not earned value helps you as a project manager. This is the PowerPoint you need to turn in by Sunday the 10th. So if you have any questions on this in-class assignment, please let me know. If you want me to review your presentation before you submit it, again, just let me know. I will definitely get to it. Okay, so that covers, I believe, chapter 13, the end of video 2. I think we made it in under 50 minutes. Our next video will go over chapters 14, talking about how do you close out a project, and chapter 15 around the differences between a traditional project management project, a waterfall project, versus agile projects. And we'll go into that next. So again, email me, text me if you have questions, and I'll see you on the next video.